When the DNA scanner blared "Access Denied" in front of thousands of elites, Liam's perfect mother suddenly went pale. She had just tried to sell something that wasn't hers, and the horrifying secret buried for 2 years was about to explode, dragging the entire family empire into the abyss. The silence inside Vane Manor did not just sit in the air. It felt engineered. The room was a vast expanse of polished white marble and floor-to-ceiling glass that looked out over the rolling vineyards of Napa Valley, but inside the temperature was set to a clinical, unforgiving chill. Steel beams intersected the ceiling like the skeleton of a predator, and every sound, the distant hum of the climate control, the soft clink of ice against crystal, seemed to echo with a hollow, metallic ring. I stood near the center of the room, my boots still caked with a thin layer of the dark, rich soil from the bio-nexus, feeling like a smudge of dirt on a pristine canvas. My mother, Margot Vane, sat in a chair made of chrome and black leather. Her posture was a masterpiece of cold elegance, her silk blouse the color of a winter cloud. She did not look at me. She looked through me as if I were a ghost haunting a house that had already moved on. My father, Pierce Vane, stood by the window, his back turned to the family. He was a man who measured the world in profit margins and strategic acquisitions. To him, the land was not a living thing to be nurtured. It was an asset to be exploited. Serena, my older sister, leaned against a marble pillar, her thumb moving rhythmically over the screen of her latest smartphone. She wore a dress that probably cost more than the annual budget for my soil restoration research. Her eyes were sharp, expectant, and devoid of anything resembling grief for the grandfather we had buried only 3 days ago. Julian Vance, the family's attorney not related by blood, sat behind a desk of reclaimed obsidian. He cleared his throat, the sound sharp in the quiet room. He did not waste time with pleasantries. The Vane family did not do sentiment. We are here to conclude the distribution of the liquid assets of Elias Vane. Julian. Vance began, his voice as dry as parchment. For the primary testament, the cash reserves and immediate discretionary funds are to be allocated as follows. He opened a leather-bound folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. He looked at Serena. To Serena Vane for her contributions to the family brand and her future role in our public relations expansion, a sum of $40 million. The room seemed to hold its breath for a heartbeat. Serena did not cheer. She simply smiled, a slow, triumphant curve of the lips that said she had expected nothing less. Julian Vance slid a check across the obsidian surface. The numbers on it were staggering, a weight of wealth that could change the course of 1,000 lives. Serena picked it up with 2 fingers as if it were a common grocery receipt. Then Julian Vance turned his gaze to me. I felt the weight of my father's silence as he finally turned around. Pierce did not look at me with anger. He looked at me with a profound, soul-deep disappointment. It was the look a banker gives a bad debt that is about to be written off. Regarding Liam Vane. Julian. Vance continued, his voice dropping an octave. There's no allocation of currency or liquid capital. Your grandfather has seen fit to exclude you from the monetary distribution entirely. The words hit me with the force of a physical blow, even though I had spent years preparing for this exact moment. $40 million for Serena. 0 for the grandson who had spent every weekend of his life in the dirt with Elias, learning the language of the earth. Margot took a slow sip of her Chardonnay, the glass catching the harsh overhead light. "Do not look so surprised, Liam," she said, her voice smooth and sharp as a diamond blade. "A legacy is a living system. It requires efficiency to survive. You have spent your life playing with microbes and mud while we built a global empire." She stood up, her heels clicking against the marble like a countdown. She walked toward me until I could smell her expensive, sterile perfume. She leaned in, her eyes locking onto mine with a terrifying clarity. "In this world, Liam the weak are a system error," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of a final judgment. "And you have always been the glitch in our design." Pierce walked over to join her, his hands clasped behind his back. "If you wanted a place at this table, you should have proven you were worth the investment," he added. "You chose the soil, now you can live in it. The humiliation was a hot, suffocating tide. I looked at the three of them, the architects of my isolation, and for a moment the room felt like it was tilting. Serena let out a short, melodic laugh as she tucked the $40 million check into her designer clutch. They were already moving on discussing dinner reservations and merger meetings, as if I had already ceased to exist. I turned and walked toward the glass doors, my footsteps heavy. I could feel the coldness of the steel and stone pressing in on me, trying to crush the warmth I still carried from my grandfather's memory. I was the son with nothing. I was the heir to an empty pocket. But as I stepped out onto the gravel driveway, leaving the sterile light of Vane Manor behind, I felt the small, hard shape of the pocket watch in my pocket, the only thing I had left. They thought they had deleted me from the system. They thought they had won because they held the gold. But they had forgotten one thing about my grandfather. Elias Vane never did anything without a reason, and he never left a debt unpaid. The silence of the vineyards was waiting for me, and in that silence I knew the real war was only just beginning. The road to the Vane Bionexus was a winding path through ancient oaks, a stark contrast to the sharp, aggressive lines of the main manor. Here, the architecture breathed. The structure was a fusion of reclaimed cedar and smart glass that adjusted its transparency based on the position of the sun. It felt like a sanctuary, the only place where the memory of Elias Vane did not feel like a cold transaction. I unlocked the heavy timber door, using my biometric scan, the only access point my parents had been unable to revoke, because the laboratory was technically a separate legal entity. The air inside smelled of damp earth ozone and the faint, sweet scent of fermented compost. It was the smell of life. I sat at my grandfather's old oak desk, which sat in the middle of a room filled with high-resolution monitors and incubation chambers. My hand trembled as I pulled the silver pocket watch from my pocket. It was heavy, the metal worn smooth by decades of his touch. I pressed the release latch. Instead of the expected photograph of my grandmother, I was met with the crystalline shimmer of a custom integrated biochip embedded into a silicon wafer. It was a sophisticated piece of hardware designed to interface with the Bionexus main server. But the laboratory felt different. The silence was too heavy. I walked over to the central server rack, the heart of the facility. My breath caught. The cooling fans were silent. The status lights were dark. Someone had initiated a remote wipe command. My father's information technology department must have attempted to sanitize the data the moment the will was read. I did not panic. I knew how Elias thought. He was a man of redundancies. I bypassed the primary terminal and knelt on the floor, removing the access panel to the secondary subterranean server. The smell of scorched plastic met my nose. They had sent a high-voltage surge through the primary circuits to fry the solid-state drives. It was an act of digital arson. I pulled a portable diagnostic interface from my bag and connected it directly to the backup core, an isolated unit protected by a Faraday cage. I began the recovery process. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, the rhythmic clicking the only sound in the dark laboratory. I had to reconstruct the fragmented metadata packets from the shadow logs. I used a low-level data recovery protocol to bypass the corrupted operating system, reaching deep into the binary architecture of the drive. Progress bars crawled across my screen. 10%, 30%, 60%. As the data began to reassemble, the truth started to bleed through the screen. I was not looking for research notes yet. I was looking for the communication logs. I accessed the encrypted history of the Vane Bionexus internal gateway. The screen illuminated my face in a ghostly blue light. A list began to populate, thousands of entries long. Every entry was a record of a call from Elias Vane's private line. Every single one was directed to my personal number. And every single one had a status flag, intercepted and redirected. I scrolled through the dates. It had started 24 months ago, exactly when my grandfather had been diagnosed with the initial stages of his illness. For 2 years, he had been trying to reach me. 2,432 calls. My eyes blurred with tears as I realized the scale of the betrayal. Margot had not just blocked my number. She'd used a sophisticated signal masking software to create a digital wall around him. Every time he dialed my number, the system would route the call to a pre-recorded voicemail loop or a simulated busy signal. On my end, I saw nothing. No missed calls, no notifications. I found a directory of audio files, the recordings of the calls the system had captured. I clicked the most recent one, dated 4 days before he passed away. My grandfather's voice was a ragged whisper, thin and fragile. "Liam, I know you are listening, even if they say you are too busy to answer. Do not believe them. The BioNexus is not about the money, it is about the key, the watch. It is the key to Project Genesis. They are trying to turn it into a weapon, Liam. You have to protect the soil. You are the only one who sees the life inside the branch." The recording cut off with the sound of a door opening and a sharp, familiar voice, Marga telling him it was time for his medication. The rage that erupted in my chest was unlike anything I had ever felt. It was a cold, volcanic heat. They had stolen his voice. They had stolen our final 2 years together. They had turned my grief into a weapon against me, making me believe he had died without a word for his only grandson. I looked at the biochip in the pocket watch. It was not just a memory. It was the master decryption key for the entire Vane BioNexus. My mother thought she had won with her $40 million, but she had no idea that the real power was sitting in the palm of my hand. She had built a fortress of marble and glass, but she had forgotten that a fortress is only as strong as the foundation it sits on, and I was about to shake the earth beneath her feet. I closed the watch with a sharp click. The war was no longer about a laboratory. It was about the 2,432 times my grandfather had called for me and the 24 months of silence they had forced us to endure. I would not just protect Project Genesis. I would dismantle every lie they had ever told. By the next morning, my name had become a digital wildfire. Serena had not spent her $40 million on luxury cars or real estate. She had invested it in a meticulously curated character assassination. I watched through the screen of my tablet as high-profile influencers and social media personalities began to post synchronized narratives. They painted me as the ungrateful black sheep Sona man who had manipulated an ailing grandfather in his final hours to seize control of a laboratory I was supposedly unqualified to run. The comment sections were a cesspool of judgment. Total strangers called me a gold digger and a fraud. They mocked my muddy boots and my obsession with the soil, contrasting my lack of ambition with the polished corporate success of the Vane family. It was a textbook execution of a modern smear campaign designed to isolate me and turn the public into a jury that had already decided my guilt. Then came the heavy artillery from Margot. A confidential source leaked a story to the Bay Chronicle that sent shockwaves through the Napa Valley elite. The headline was a masterpiece of cruelty. "The Vane void is the prodigal son, even a Vane." The article suggested that Margot and Pierce had discovered evidence that I was not Pierce's biological son. It implied that my grandfather Elias had been aware of this betrayal and had excluded me from the liquid inheritance as a result. The world wanted me to scream. They wanted me to record a defensive video to hire my own public relations team and to fight fire with fire. But I did not say a word. I did not post a single rebuttal. Silence is a form of power that my mother never understood. She believed that whoever spoke the loudest owned the truth. She was wrong. While the digital world burned my reputation, I was in the greenhouse of the BioNexus. I had used the biochip from the pocket watch to unlock the deepest layer of the laboratory's archives, the restricted data for Project Genesis. The project was not just a soil study. It was a revolutionary synthesis of rapid growth botanical acceleration and carbon sequestration. Elias had engineered seeds that did not follow the traditional laws of seasons. I held a handful of the small, translucent seeds in my palm. They felt warm, vibrating with a subtle kinetic energy. I knelt in the center of the experimental garden, the soil cool and moist against my skin. I planted the first row of Genesis oaks. I used the precision irrigation system to deliver a specific nutrient cocktail formula I had reconstructed from the encrypted files. They think they have buried me, I whispered to the empty greenhouse. They have forgotten that I am a seed. Within 48 hours, the impossible happened. The ground did not just crack, it surged. Through the high-resolution security cameras, I watched as the saplings erupted from the earth with a violent, beautiful speed. By the third day, the trees were already 5 feet tall, their leaves a deep iridescent emerald that seemed to absorb every photon of light in the room. They were not just plants. They were biological machines growing at a rate that defied every textbook in the world. The bionexus was humming. The sensors indicated a massive drop in local carbon dioxide levels as the trees began their work. This was the true inheritance. This was the power that Apex Prime wanted to buy for $500 million, the ability to terraform a wasteland in a matter of weeks. Margot and Pierce were busy hosting secret meetings with the directors of Apex Prime. They were showing off stolen, incomplete datasets promising to sell the Vane legacy to the highest bidder. They believed they had neutralized me. They believed that by calling me illegitimate, they had stripped away my authority to speak for the Vane name. They thought they had won because they had erased me from the social register and the bank accounts. But they had forgotten the most basic rule of the laboratory. In a system built on encryption and biolocks, the only thing that matters is the key. And they were about to realize that the key was not a name, and it was not a check for $40 million. What would happen when they tried to prove ownership of a project that was literally coded to my existence? How would they explain the sudden miraculous forest growing inside a laboratory they claimed I was too incompetent to manage? They thought they were the architects of my destruction, but they were merely the spectators of their own obsolescence. The stage was being set for the Foundation Gala, and the trees were already reaching for the ceiling, tall and silent witnesses to the truth. They had given Serena the gold, and they had given me the earth. They were about to find out which one was more valuable. The grand ballroom of the Silver Oak Pavilion was a sea of black ties, silk gowns, and the sharp artificial scent of expensive gardenias. This was the centerpiece of the Napa Valley social calendar, the Vane Charity Auction. But tonight, the charity was a front. The real event was the quiet $500 million deal waiting in the wings. Margot and Pierce stood on the raised dais flanked by the directors of Apex Prime. They looked like royalty, bathed in the golden glow of the chandeliers projecting an image of absolute control. Margot held a silver microphone, her voice amplified and smooth as velvet. "Tonight, we do not just celebrate the past," she announced to the hushed crowd. "We unveil the future of the Vane legacy. Project Genesis is more than an innovation. It is our gift to the world, a testament to the bloodline that built this valley." On the large screen behind her, a digital rendering of the Project Genesis logo pulsed with light. To finalize the transfer of the intellectual property to Apex Prime, a biometric terminal had been placed on a pedestal in the center of the stage. It was a sleek, brushed aluminum tower, the same technology Elias had used to secure the bionexus. To transfer the patents, the system required a biological verification of the Vane lineage. I chose that moment to enter. The heavy oak doors at the back of the hall swung open. The sound of my heavy boots on the polished floor cut through Margot's speech like a physical blow. I was not wearing a tuxedo. I was wearing the same work shirt I had been wearing in the greenhouse, stained with the dark, living soil of the bionexus. My hair was windblown and I smelled of rain and ozone. The room fell into a stunned, suffocating silence. 1,000 pairs of eyes turned toward me. I saw Serena stiffen her hand, tightening around her champagne glass until her knuckles turned white. Pierce looked as if he wanted to call security, but the cameras of the Bay Chronicle were already rolling. "You are late, Liam," Margot said, her voice dripping with a forced icy pity. "But then again, you were never one for timing, or for family." "I am exactly where I need to be," I said, my voice steady and echoing through the hall. "You are trying to sell something that does not belong to you." Margot let out a short, mocking laugh. She turned to the representative from Apex Prime. Please excuse my son. He has been struggling with reality lately." She turned back to the terminal. "Shall we proceed?" She placed her hand on the glowing glass plate of the DNA scanner. This was the moment she had engineered. By claiming I was not Pierce's biological son, she thought she had paved the way for her own authority. The scanner hummed a thin line of blue light tracing the patterns of her palm. The crowd leaned forward, sensing the tension. The screen on the terminal flickered. A sharp, dissonant chime rang through the ballroom. "Access denied," the voice of the system announced, cold and mechanical. "Biological signature mismatch. Authorization void." Margot's face drained of color. She pressed her hand harder against the glass, her composure beginning to crack. "There is a mistake. This is a vein system. I am the matriarch of this family," she tried again. The red text on the screen grew larger. "Bloodline mismatch detected. Encryption lock engaged." Whispers erupted like a swarm of hornets. The directors of Apex Prime looked at each other, their faces filled with sudden sharp suspicion. If Margot could not unlock the system, the $500 million deal was worth nothing more than the paper it was written on. "The system is not looking for a name on a birth certificate, Margot," I said as I walked up the steps of the stage. "It is looking for the one Elias chose. It is looking for the one who actually understands the life inside the code." I stood before the terminal. I took a small sterile lancet from my pocket and made a tiny prick on the tip of my finger. I did not hesitate. I let a single drop of my blood fall onto the center of the glass scanner. For a heartbeat, the room was silent. Then the terminal did not just hum, it sang. A deep, resonant pulse of energy rippled outwards from the pedestal. The blue light turned into a brilliant, blinding white. Across the valley, 3 miles away at the Bionexus, the emergency floodlights ignited, sending a pillar of light into the night sky that was visible through the ballroom windows. Identity confirmed, the system boomed. "Welcome, Liam Vane. Project Genesis, full access granted." Every screen in the ballroom suddenly filled with the real data, not the incomplete files Margot had tried to sell, but the living, breathing heart of the project. The rapid growth algorithms, the soil restoration blueprints, and the final video message from Elias Vane. The entire ballroom was bathed in the light of the Bionexus. Margot stood frozen, her hand still hovering over the scanner that had rejected her. She had spent 2 years trying to erase me, and in 10 seconds the Earth itself had recognized my voice. "You told the world I was a system error," I said, looking her directly in the eyes as the crowd watched in total shock. "But it turns out I am the only one who actually belongs in the system." The empire of glass and marble was not just cracking, it was shattering. And as the lights of the Bionexus continued to burn bright against the Napa sky, I knew that the truth was no longer a secret. It was a revolution. The golden glow of the ballroom felt sickly now, like the light reflected off a tarnished coin. While the guests stood paralyzed by the sight of the Bionexus illuminating the horizon, I did not step down from the stage. The biometric confirmation was only the beginning of the evening. I tapped the interface of the pocket watch one final time, uploading a secondary encrypted stream to the massive projectors. "You spent 2 years telling the world that Elias Vane was losing his mind," I said, my voice cutting through the rising murmurs of the crowd. "You used his illness as a shield to hide your theft, but my grandfather knew exactly what you were doing. He did not lose his memory. You tried to erase it." The screen behind me flickered. The digital renderings of Project Genesis vanished, replaced by a raw, high-definition video feed. It was recorded in the private study of the Bionexus, dated only weeks before Elias passed away. My grandfather sat in his oak chair, his face gaunt, but his eyes burning with a terrifying lucid clarity. "If you are watching this, it means my blood has finally opened the gate," Elias said on the screen, his voice steady despite his frailty. "For 18 months, Margot and Pierce Vane have systematically administered a cocktail of scopolamine and low-dose benzodiazepines into my daily fluids. They called it vitamin therapy. In reality, it was a chemical erasure designed to induce cognitive decline and force my signature on the transfer of the Vane patents. A collective gasp swept through the room like a cold wind. Margot tried to move toward the sound system, but a group of uniformed officers had already entered from the side entrances of the pavilion. These were not private security. They were federal agents and local detectives I had contacted days ago, armed with the digital evidence I had recovered from the BioNexus servers. "The data you see on the screen now," I said, pointing to the scrolling logs appearing beside the video, "is the forensic chemical analysis from the laboratory's atmospheric sensors. It recorded the exact compounds present in the house during my grandfather's final months. It matches the pharmaceutical orders Pierce made through a shell company in the Cayman Islands." The evidence was undeniable. It was a digital trail of breadcrumbs that led straight to the master suite of Vane Manor. This was no longer a family dispute about a will. It was a criminal indictment for elder abuse conspiracy and attempted corporate espionage. The representative from Apex Prime stepped back from Pierce as if he were contaminated. The $500 million deal was not just dead. It had become a legal radioactive zone. Margot stood perfectly still, her mask of elegance finally shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces. She looked at the police, then at the crowd, and finally at me. For the first time in my life, I saw something in her eyes that was not dismissal. It was terror. Pierce, however, broke. The man who had built his life on the image of the stoic, untouchable patriarch collapsed. He stumbled toward the stage, his knees hitting the polished marble with a dull thud. He reached out a hand toward me, his face twisted in a desperate, pathetic mask of regret. "Liam, please," he choked out, his voice cracking. "We are family. We can fix this. We can split the proceeds. Think of the Vane name. Think of what this will do to our history. Just give us a little more time to explain." I looked down at him, but I felt no satisfaction, only a profound sense of closure. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the silver watch. I held it up so he could see the steady rhythmic movement of the second Honda hand that had been moving long before he was born and would continue long after he was gone. "You had 24 months to tell the truth, Pierce," I said, my voice cold and final. "You had 2,432 chances to answer his calls. You used technology to build a prison for a dying man." I clicked the watch shut. The sound was as sharp as a gavel in a courtroom. "Your time is up," I said. As the officers moved in to place Margot and Pierce in handcuffs, the ballroom remained silent. There was no applause, only the heavy weight of justice finally settling into the room. Serena stood in the corner, her $40 million check still clutched in her hand, but she looked at it as if it were a piece of lead. The Vane legacy was not destroyed, but the false empire built on marble and lies was gone. I walked off the stage past the cameras and the stunned socialites and headed toward the doors. I did not need their approval. I had the truth, I had the law, and for the first time in 2 years I could finally breathe the air of a world that was no longer waiting for a miracle. The miracle had already happened. The seed had broken through the stone. The fall of the Vane dynasty was as swift as the growth of the Genesis oaks. In the months that followed, I watched the clinical, silent halls of Vane Manor stripped of their luxury as the courts began the grinding process of asset forfeiture. Margot and Pierce Vaniance, the untouchable architects of Napa Valley, were separated and held in different cells awaiting a trial that would likely consume the rest of their lives. Every contract they had signed and every dollar they had hidden was pulled into the light and dissected by federal investigators. Serena fared no better. The $40 million check she had carried like a weapon of social power was clawed back by the estate's executors tied to patents and assets now tangled in the elder abuse investigation. The same elite circle she had tried to lead turned its back on her just as quickly as it had once bowed to the illusion of success. But while the old world crumbled, the Vane BioNexus transformed. I chose not to sell the technology to a corporation. Instead, I established the Elias Vane Institute for Open Agriculture. The heavy timber doors were no longer locked by biometric scanners for the few. They were open to university students, local farmers, and school children from across the state. The laboratory, once a fortress of secrets, became a hub of shared knowledge. The Project Genesis trees did more than just grow. They thrived. They acted as a natural filtration system, healing the soil that had been depleted by decades of industrial farming. The air around the Institute felt different, crisper, cleaner, filled with the hum of bees and the laughter of volunteers. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon, the heat of the summer had begun to mellow into a golden autumn. I stood in the central courtyard beneath the massive, sprawling branches of the ancient magnolia tree that had been my grandfather's favorite. Its white blossoms were in full glorious bloom, their fragrance thick and sweet, reminiscent of the blue ink on his old notebooks. Skye walked across the grass, her boots leaving soft imprints in the healthy dark mulch. She was carrying a small ceramic pot. Inside was a tiny, vibrant sapling, its leaves shimmering with the unmistakable emerald hue of the Genesis strain. "The latest batch from the nursery," Skye said, handing the pot to me with a smile. "This one is special. It is a hybrid of the Genesis code and the native oaks. It is stronger, more resilient. It is ready for the world." I took the small plant, feeling the warmth of the soil through the ceramic. It was a life I had helped create, not through manipulation or greed, but through understanding and patience. "My grandfather used to say that time would prove who deserved this place," I said, looking up at the magnolia tree. "I used to think he meant a legal victory or a financial one. I was wrong." Skye nodded, looking at the children playing near the irrigation beds. "What do you think he meant?" "He meant that you do not own a legacy," I replied, the realization finally settling deep in my soul. "You only borrow it from the future. A name is just a label on a building, but a legacy is a living thing. It is not found in the family crest or the bank accounts. It is found in what you choose to nurture." I knelt and placed the new sapling at the base of the great magnolia. The two generations of growth sat side by side, the old oak providing the shade and the new seed carrying the light. I was no longer the son of Pierce Vane or the grandson of a wealthy man. I was simply Liam, a steward of the earth finally free from the cold marble prison of my past. The silver pocket watch remained in my pocket, but I no longer needed to check the time. For the first time in my life, I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The sun began to set over the Napa Valley, painting the sky in shades of violet and gold, and for miles in every direction the earth was breathing again. Now that you have seen the full journey of Liam and the truth behind the Vane legacy, I have one question for you. If you had been in Liam's position and discovered that your own parents had betrayed you and your grandfather so deeply, would you have been able to forgive them, or was justice the only path to peace? Let me know in the comments below. Share your thoughts in the comments and follow for more inspiring, meaningful journeys. Your support keeps these stories growing. Join our community and never miss a chapter.